In May of 1606, a man knelt on the cobblestones of a Roman street, his sword wet with blood. The body of Ranuccio Tomassoni lay at his feet. And Michelangelo Merisi da Caravaggio, the most celebrated painter in Italy, became a wanted man. Death penalty. That was the sentence. Not prison, not exile, death. The papal decree was absolute. Anyone in the papal states could legally kill Caravaggio on sight and collect the bounty. His head quite literally had a price on it. Think about that for a second. The most revolutionary artist of his generation, a man whose name was spoken in every court and every church in Rome, was now a hunted animal. He couldn't walk into a room without scanning the faces, couldn't sleep without the weapon, couldn't trust anyone. And yet, in those years of running, Caravaggio created some of the most profound paintings in the history of art. Paintings that were not just masterpieces of technique, but confessions. The last of those messages was a painting called David with the Head of Goliath. You probably know the biblical story. Young David, a shepherd boy, defeats the giant Goliath and cuts off his head. A triumphant moment. A hero story told 1,000 times. But look closer at this particular painting. Look at the face on that severed head. It's Caravaggio. Caravaggio painted himself as the decapitated giant, his own mouth open in what looks like a final gasp, his own eyes hollow and lifeless. He didn't paint himself as David the victor. He painted himself as the monster, the defeated, the condemned. Why would he do that? Why would a man fleeing execution choose to immortalize himself as a severed head? The answer is one of the most devastating stories in the history of art, and it changes everything you think you know about what a painting can be. The Rome that Caravaggio fled in 1606 had made him famous. He was in his mid-30s, and his work was unlike anything anyone had seen. While other painters idealized their subjects, smooth skin, angelic light, perfect proportions, Caravaggio gave you the real thing, dirty feet, wrinkled faces, shadows so deep they seemed to swallow the canvas. This technique became known as chiaroscuro, the dramatic contrast between light and darkness. Caravaggio didn't invent it, but he wielded it like no one before or since. His figures didn't just emerge from dark backgrounds, they were ambushed by light, caught in a single moment of revelation, and that was exactly who Caravaggio was. By day, he moved through the highest circles of Roman society. Cardinals commissioned his work. The most powerful families in Italy competed for his paintings. When he unveiled the calling of Saint Matthew in a small church called San Luigi dei Francesi, the crowds were so dense that people were injured just trying to get inside. But by night, Caravaggio was something else entirely. He walked the streets with a sword at his side, a dagger in his belt, and a small group of men who were part entourage, part street gang. He was arrested repeatedly for throwing artichokes at a waiter, for insulting a rival painter, for carrying unlicensed weapons. He once wounded a man in a fight over a woman. He was volatile, proud, incapable of backing down. This is not an apology for what happened next. What happened next was a man died. On the evening of May 28, 1606, Caravaggio and Ranuccio Tomassoni met near the Campo Marzio. They argued. Swords were drawn. Accounts differ on what started it. A gambling debt, a tennis match dispute, an insult to a woman's honor. But the outcome is not in question. Caravaggio ran his sword through Tomassoni. The man bled out on the street, and Caravaggio ran. He went first to the Spanish-controlled territory south of Rome, then to Naples, a sprawling, violent city where a wanted man could disappear. And it was in Naples that something shifted in Caravaggio's work. Before the killing, his paintings were revolutionary in their technique, but conventional in their subjects. Saints, biblical scenes, commissioned portraits. After the killing, something darker entered the frame. Not in a sensational way, not in a way that glorified the violence, but in a way that suggested the painter was now asking different questions. What does it feel like to be condemned? What does it feel like to know that death is following you, getting closer with every passing week? What does it feel like to be utterly, completely alone? In Naples, Caravaggio painted the flagellation of Christ, a man being beaten, his body twisting away from the whip, and the man holding that whip is barely visible, dissolving into shadow. The darkness isn't just an aesthetic choice anymore, it's a psychological state. From Naples, Caravaggio fled to Malta, and this is where the story takes an almost unbelievable turn. Malta was controlled by the Knights of St. John, a military religious order, essentially an army of monks. Caravaggio arrived as a fugitive, but his fame preceded him. He painted a massive altarpiece for the knights, and in an extraordinary gesture, they offered him something that should have solved everything. They made him a Knight of Malta himself. For a man under a death sentence from Rome, this was the ultimate protection. A Knight of Malta was essentially untouchable. The Pope himself would think twice before moving against the order. For a brief moment, Caravaggio must have believed he had found safety. And then, in a move that still baffles historians, he destroyed it all. Within months of becoming a knight, Caravaggio was involved in another violent incident. The details are murky: an argument with a fellow knight, a door broken down, shots fired. He was imprisoned by the order he had just joined, and then, in a scene that could have come from one of his own paintings, he escaped. In the middle of the night, he scaled the walls of the fortress, lowered himself into the darkness, and fled once again. The knights expelled him formally, stripping him of his title in a ceremony described as stripping a rotten limb from the body. He was now a fugitive from two authorities, Rome and Malta. Caravaggio made his way to Sicily. By now, the pattern was unmistakable. Every time he fled, he went further south, further from the center of power, further into the margins. And every time, he produced work of extraordinary power. In Sicily, he painted the burial of Saint Lucy. The saint lies dead on the ground, her face pale, while two massive grave diggers prepare to lower her body into the earth. The painting is enormous, nearly 4 meters wide, and the figures are placed so low on the canvas that the viewer seems to be standing right at the edge of the grave, looking down. There is no hope in this painting. No divine light breaking through the clouds, just the brute physical reality of death, a body being put into the ground. It is a painting by a man who knows that there is no escape. But in Sicily, something else was happening. News was traveling through the network of cardinals and nobles who still admired Caravaggio's work. The Pope's nephew, Cardinal Scipione Borghese, was an obsessive collector. He wanted a Caravaggio painting, badly, and he had the one thing Caravaggio desperately needed: influence over the Pope. A deal began to take shape, not official, not in writing, but the whispers were clear. If Caravaggio could produce a painting significant enough, moving enough, powerful enough, then Cardinal Borghese might be persuaded to advocate for a pardon. Caravaggio was somewhere between Sicily and Naples when he began work on his offering. Now let's look at the painting itself, because once you know the context, every single element reads differently. David with the Head of Goliath, painted around 1609 or 1610, in the final months of Caravaggio's life. It's not a large painting, about 1 meter by 1.25 meters, and yet it hits you with physical force. On the left, David, a young man, his body emerging from deep shadow. He holds a sword in one hand, in the other, he extends the severed head of Goliath toward the viewer, except it's not really David, not a triumphant David anyway. Look at David's face. He's not celebrating, there's no pride in his expression. His brow is furrowed, his eyes are downcast, he looks almost sad, as if the act of violence has cost him something, as if he's not showing off a trophy but presenting evidence of a tragedy. And look at his sword. On the blade, barely visible, is a Latin inscription. It reads HSOS, an abbreviation of Humilitas Occidit Superbiam. It means humility kills pride. That's not a message about David and Goliath. That's a message about Caravaggio himself. Because on the right side of the painting, in David's outstretched hand, is the severed head. Goliath's face frozen in death, the mouth open, the eyes blank. It is Caravaggio's own face. There is no ambiguity here. The nose, the brow, the deep-set eyes. It's a self-portrait, and a brutally honest one. Caravaggio didn't idealize himself. He painted himself as a dead man. His skin is pale, almost gray. His right eye is swollen. Blood drips from the severed neck. Not in a gory, sensational way, but simply as a fact. This is a man who has been killed. Why would Caravaggio do this? For 400 years, art historians have debated the answer, but the theory that has gained the most ground is also the most human. This painting was Caravaggio's plea for mercy. In the biblical story, David brings Goliath's head to King Saul as proof of his victory. Caravaggio is doing the same thing, but he's offering his own head to Cardinal Borghese and through him to the Pope. The painting says, "I am the monster. I am the one who deserves to die. Look at me. Look at what I have become." But David is not proud of what he's done, and maybe, just maybe, the authority that holds the power of life and death can find it within itself to show mercy. It is an extraordinary act of psychological vulnerability. The most famous painter in Italy, a knight of Malta, a man who had walked through the palaces of cardinals and the courts of princes, reduced to sending this silent, desperate message, "Forgive me." The tragedy is what happened next. Caravaggio finished the painting and set out for Rome. He packed his belongings, including several paintings meant to prove his worth and secure his pardon. He boarded a boat, or perhaps a series of boats, up the coast. The details of exactly what happened are lost to history, but the broad strokes are clear enough. Somewhere near the coast of Tuscany, Caravaggio was arrested, not in Rome, not by the papal authorities, but by some local force, perhaps Spanish soldiers, perhaps port officials who didn't recognize him. He was detained, and by the time he was released, the boat carrying his paintings had sailed on. Caravaggio was now alone on a beach in the summer heat of 1610. His paintings, his proof, his bargaining chips, his passport home were gone. He was desperate. He chased the boat on foot, walking for days along the coast, trying to find the harbor where it had docked. He never found it. Somewhere near Porto Ercole in July of 1610, Caravaggio collapsed. A fever took hold, and on July 18th, just days before word of his papal pardon finally arrived in the port town, Michelangelo Merisi da Caravaggio died. He was 38 years old. The pardon had been granted, the pleading had worked, but the message and the man never reached each other. Now let me ask you something. When you look at David with the head of Goliath, knowing that story, knowing that the man on that canvas never made it home, never received the mercy he was begging for, never knew that he had been forgiven, what do you see? I see something different than I used to. I used to see a painting about guilt, about a man who had done something terrible and couldn't escape it. And that's in there, certainly. But now I see a painting about hope, because Caravaggio painted this while he was still running, while he was still a fugitive, while he was still alive, barely perhaps, but alive. And the very act of painting it was an act of hope. It was a bet on the possibility of mercy. It was a man, broken and terrified and alone, saying with the only tool he had, "I am still human. I can still make something beautiful. Please see me." That's not a story about a monster. It's a story about what happens when a human being falls, and then, against all odds, reaches for something better. The painting didn't save Caravaggio's life, but it has outlived every cardinal who judged him, every soldier who hunted him, every authority that condemned him. For 4 centuries, people have stood before it in the Galleria Borghese in Rome, and they have felt what he was trying to communicate across time. And I think that's what Caravaggio understood, perhaps better than any artist before or since. A painting is not just pigment on canvas. It's a message thrown into the future, a voice that says, across centuries, I was here, I was suffering, and I made something anyway. Which Caravaggio painting do you think is his most powerful? Comment below. I read every single one. Hit subscribe, because next week we're uncovering another story behind a masterpiece, not just to look at the art, but to feel it.